Well, good evening. I'm Andy Bannister from Solas, and I would love to welcome you, whether you're watching this live or later on catch up, to another exciting and packed Solas webinar. As always on these webinars, we love to welcome guests from often around the world, but this evening we're delighted to have a good friend of mine who is actually in the UK, just a few hours south of where we are in Scotland. Really excited to welcome to this webinar Michael Otts. Michael, where are you? There he is. Hi, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. I didn't know whether you were asking where are you as in why am I not on the screen, or where am I in the UK?
Well, actually, you could take it both those ways. Where are you in the UK precisely?
In a little village called Keam, which is just outside Leicester, which is slightly better known than our village.
Of course, essentially I always think what's funny, when I was a Londoner, you'd have been a northerner to me, but now you're a southerner, so it's all a matter of perspective.
It's all relative, yeah.
Now, Michael, you wear a number of hats. You're a writer, you're a speaker, you've been a broadcaster, you do media, that kind of sort of stuff as well. You do lots of stuff in universities and other kind of settings, helping people think about the big questions of life. Would that be a kind of good description of what you spend your time doing?
Yeah, I think so. I guess my conviction that the Christian faith is not only true objectively, but it's existentially relevant to every area of life. And so primarily in the university context, as I was this week in Liverpool and the week before in Manchester and so on, often at the invitation of Christian university students, giving talks looking at the interaction between the Christian faith and all sorts of different topics like we look at in the book.
Yeah, you mentioned the book because this evening's webinar is structured around your new book. You've written several books, but there we are. There it is. Making Sense of Life is the new book. And in a minute, what we're going to do, I've got some questions to ask about the book. We're going to dive into it and some of the themes in it. But right at the start, just to let kind of viewers know, we have an exciting opportunity. You can actually win a copy of Michael's book. What an amazing opportunity for Thursday night. And the way that works, I'll plug this a few times throughout the webinar. There'll be an email address popping up in a minute. If you send your name into the email address, there we are, there's the free book draw. You email us at support@solascpc.org and just give your name and address. Now, the one catch to this is you have to be a UK resident. I know these webinars often end up going all over the world to amazing places, but on this particular occasion, I'm afraid to get one of these free books, you do have to reside in the UK. Or if you reside overseas, quickly find yourself a friend in the UK who could then forward that book to you. You can get hold of the book if you live elsewhere in the world, but the freebie is, and we've got the postage sponsored for the UK, but not elsewhere. Anyway, we'll plug that again later. Send your name and address in, and it's a great book if you're someone who is not a follower of Jesus, but is interested in faith and interested in spirituality, intrigued by life's big questions. It's a book that will really help you. If you are already a Jesus follower, this is a great book to give to friends who are seeking and searching. So the first question I have, Michael, in a minute we're going to dive into some of the themes of the book, but why don't we start by telling us, why did you write this? What led you to put pen to paper and write Making Sense of Life?
Well, as you know, Andy, it's clearly because it's the best way to make money. Well, no. As a fellow author, you know that's probably not the case for most writers. Why did I write it? It's the third book I've written. The first book I wrote was a book called What Kind of God? And I wrote that about 15 years ago now. And it was at a time when the new atheist movement had kind of gained traction, and a lot of people had objections to the Christian faith. And that sought to kind of address some of those objections that people have. But what I've, I guess, increasingly become aware of, especially in my work in universities here in the UK and in other parts of Europe, is that a lot of people don't necessarily have objections to the Christian faith. Maybe they've never even thought much about the Christian faith. But the question is more, is it relevant? Is it relevant to my life? Does it connect with the things that I am concerned with? And so I increasingly found myself thinking, I'd love to have something to give away to people who think that Christianity is maybe irrelevant, or maybe have never even thought about its relevance. Basically to show how Christianity makes sense of the things that really matter most in life. And so I started thinking about the kind of things that people really do care about, even if people are not necessarily saying that they care about Christianity. I've found that everyone cares about something. And there are some things that lots of people seem to have in common in terms of their concerns. So things like human rights and equality, things like freedom, love, a desire for hope, and so on. And so pulling together some of these common concerns, issues and questions that we might have, regardless of whether we would count ourselves as religious or spiritual or even believed in God, and then try to use that as a starting point to say, how does Christianity make sense of these things? And I guess the point that hopefully recurs through the book is that I think, unlike anything else, Christianity makes the best sense of all of these things. It gives us a reason for why they matter in the first place, but it also shows us how we can find the things that we're really looking for in life, ultimately in the Christian faith and in the claims of Jesus.
Well, in a moment, we're going to dive in some of the topics. There's 10 kind of topics, 10 themes you explore in the book. But just to give kind of viewers a roadmap for where we're going to go. So I'm going to grill Michael kind of lightly. I like grilling for the next 25, 30 minutes or so. And then around about 7:30, 25 to 8 for those watching in the UK, or watching this live at least, we will then shift into a time of Q&A. And just again, to give you a heads up, how good the Q&A is really is down to listeners. So we need you to participate. So there's a URL that's just popped up at the bottom of the screen. So you would go to pigeonhole.at/Solas 3 March. That is today's date for those who are not keeping up. And so that will pop up the Q&A for this event. And you could do a couple of things. If you've got a question, as I talk to Michael, if Michael says something you disagree with, want more information on, or even just something even vaguely related, you can throw it into the Q&A. You can ask it, and you can do that anonymously. If you prefer to not have your name there, you can do that, or you can tell us your name. But here's the other thing: if you don't have a question, you're sitting there thinking, "I'd love to take part in the Q&A, but I just can't think of a question." You can vote on other questions. You can see what other people have asked, and you can vote for your favorite one. Get it to the top of the list. And what I'll do, I will start. When we do Q&A, I'll basically work through the most popular questions. So there we go. Whether it's a question about life or it's a question about making sourdough, one of Michael's many hobbies, we can dive into that. But Michael, let's dive into the first topic I wanted to address, talk about a bit. One of the topics that you talk about in the book is the whole question of making sense of happiness, right? And that's a big question in our age. Particularly, I think COVID swept a lot of things away. Life was quite easy before. You wanted an easy holiday in Antigua, it was dead easy to do that. Now things are a bit more, have been a bit more complicated. So I suppose my first question, if you're on happiness, why do we struggle to find happiness? It does seem to be the case that it isn't easy, or it might be easy for a while and then something goes pear-shaped. Why is it we struggle to find happiness?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In the research of the book, there are a few books on happiness that I read. Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt was one of them. One of the things that he says is that happiness is harder to find than we think. We assume that we know where happiness is located. So, for instance, we might assume that happiness is based on changing our circumstances. If only we can change our outward circumstances, then we would be happier. And he says, well, in the short term, that's true. In the short term, if you win the lottery, you'll suddenly feel a lot happier. But in the long term, our changing of circumstances doesn't really change our emotional state beyond a few months, probably a year at most. And to do that, he references some studies that were done that tracked people who had a sudden upturn in their circumstantial situation. They won the lottery, they got married, or something very positive happened in their life. And then other people who had a sudden downturn in their circumstances, they suddenly made, for instance, quadriplegic in a road traffic accident. And of course, the people who had a positive upturn suddenly felt happiness. The people who had a downturn in their circumstances felt unhappy. But within a year, almost all of them had returned to their emotional state that they were at before. In other words, circumstances don't have the power to change our long-term emotional state in the way that we think they do. And then tied to that, another book by Oliver James, a psychologist, called affluenza, not influenza, but affluenza, this idea that in Western society in particular, we're suffering from this disease called affluenza, the disease that makes us think that with increased affluence comes increased happiness. And he says, of course, if you're living in abject poverty, then increasing one's affluence will increase one's happiness. But beyond that, it will have less of an impact. And actually, at a certain point, it starts to have an inverse proportional effect. In other words, increasing your affluence actually decreases your happiness. So we think, if only I can get stuff, if only I can change my circumstances, I'll be happy. And actually, studies show that that doesn't seem to be the case. Another guy, Talban Shahar, who for many years ran, I think, the most popular course at Harvard, a course on how to be happy. I guess that's why it was most popular, because everyone wants to be happy. Says that there are these kind of two routes that people think lead to happiness. One is to say happiness is based on just doing what gives me the most happiness right now, the kind of hedonist view of happiness. And that's very short-sighted and often leads to making poor life choices. The other is the kind of rat race view of happiness, he says, which is to say happiness is located in some future event, and I sacrifice stuff now for the sake of that future event. But ultimately, what if I get to that future moment and find that what I thought was going to give me happiness, that job, that career, that retirement, that relationship or whatever, doesn't actually give me the happiness that I desire? And so actually what was interesting about all those three books is that they reveal that happiness is harder to find than we think, because we maybe are looking for it in the wrong places.
Yeah, it reminded me as you said that, is that one of my sort of favorite kind of classic movies from a few years ago. Do you remember the movie Cool Runnings, the Jamaican kind of bobsleigh team? And there's a really interesting moment where John Candy, isn't it, plays the coach, and there's that scene where he's talking about the gold medal, and because they desperately want the gold medal. And there's that very famous line where he says, if life is not enough for you now, effectively, it won't be enough with the gold medal. You think that that's what you want to aim for, but ultimately it's going to let you down. So I suppose the question I was going to ask that kind of spun off that is happiness the thing we should be actually aiming at? I remember being a year or two ago, we were in a group of friends, and one of the group of friends in this sort of circle, so I think sort of stunned quite a few people by, we were talking about parenting, and they sort of sat back reflexively and said, I don't think I want my kids to be happy. That's not the golden life I want them to aim at. I want them to be people of good character. If they get happiness as a bonus. And you could see some people were like, whoa, really? Is there something in that? Is happiness actually the thing we should be aiming at? Or should we be aiming at something else, and then we might get happiness thrown in if we're lucky?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the kind of reasons why, and I talk about this in the chapter on making sense of pain and suffering, that in Western society that we struggle perhaps with suffering is because we've made my personal happiness right now the kind of number one aim in life. Ask lots of people, what's the point of life? To be happy. And of course, if that is the aim in life, if that's the number one priority in life, then suffering will always stop us from achieving that aim. It will always be a barrier to it. So the irony, of course, is that in Western society in the 21st century, we suffer less relative to other societies and other generations, and yet we struggle with suffering more. Why? Because we've made happiness the ultimate aim. And it does seem, doesn't it, that happiness often seems to be a byproduct of something else. When we pursue happiness, actually, it often evades us. But actually, when we pursue other things that are not primarily about our immediate happiness, we discover happiness almost as the side product that we weren't expecting. Jordan Peterson in 12 Rules for Life, I quote this in the book, one of his rules, or one of his first 12 rules, I know he's now got 12 more rules for life. I'm not sure whether he's just going to keep on making more and more rules. But in his first 12 rules for life, he talks about how we need to pursue what is pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. In other words, find something purposeful to live for. And actually, one of the byproducts might be that we also discover happiness along the way. I was also reading, I don't mention it in the book, I read it afterwards, but Sebastian Junger, a war correspondent, journalist, wrote a fascinating book called Tribe. And he tracks people in Western society who lived through periods of war or who fought in war. And he found a strange phenomenon, which is that they look back at that time when they were experiencing war, and they almost look back at it with a sense of wistfulness. Now, it wasn't that they wanted to go back to the pain, the suffering, the bloodshed, but there was something about war that brought people together for a greater purpose and gave people a sense of camaraderie and community that in Western society we don't seem to have. And in Western society, we don't seem to know what we're living for, what our purpose is, and we're very individualistic. And so actually finding something beyond ourselves might be a route to finding purpose and potentially even happiness as well.
Got one last question on happiness, and then I want to move on to the second of our three topics, Michael. Okay, so obviously we're not just talking about this in a vacuum. This is really in the context of, does Christianity have something different to offer here? So one objection I would sometimes heard from skeptical friends would be, well, hang on a minute. When it comes to happiness and religion, isn't Christianity all about the removal of happiness? Become a Christian, it's all about the things you're going to give up. Somebody might say, right now, I can drink what I want, do what I want, sleep with whom I want, take the drugs I want, I can do all the things I want, become a Christian, all those things go. It's all restriction, restriction, restriction. So, come on, what can Christianity possibly have to offer into this conversation? Now, I know you'd have something to say.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. The impression that we might have of the Christian faith is not necessarily an invitation to, overwhelming happiness. It often feels like maybe a life of restriction, repressing one's desires. And yet actually, the Christian faith talks about a God who created us in his image. And so if we have this desire for happiness, for joy, that's because actually we're created by a God who expresses that and created us for that purpose. So our desire for happiness is not wrong. And I love the words of C.S. Lewis, the author, writer. He says, if we consider what God promises to us in the Gospels, in the Christian faith, the problem that we will find is not that our desires are too strong, but too weak. And then he goes on to say, we're like half-hearted creatures fooling around in the slum because we can't imagine what's meant by an offer of a holiday at the seaside. In other words, our desires are not too small, but not too big, but too weak. We think, as long as I can have a job, go out at the weekends, be able to go down and watch the footy, life is fine. That'll be enough. But what if I was made for more than that? What if actually I was created for even more significance? And so I would say actually Jesus, on one occasion said, I've come to give you life and life in all its fullness. He wasn't coming to take away life. He was coming to give us life in the way that it was meant to be lived. Now, that is subversive in some ways because it's not just saying go and do whatever you want. But actually that's because, as we've already seen, when we look at, maybe our own lives and certainly the studies of people like Jonathan Haidt and others that I mentioned, just doing whatever I want, whenever I want, doesn't actually lead to happiness anyway. And so there is a different route. And again, to quote Lewis, he has this lovely line where he says, aim at earth and we get nothing, aim at heaven and we get earth thrown in. In other words, if our aim is my happiness now, often I won't find it. But if my aim is something beyond my happiness, finding a bigger purpose, discovering the God who created me, knowing what it is to live in relationship with him, then actually what I might find as a byproduct of that is also periods of real joy. I guess I'd also want to talk about the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is often dependent on happenings, as you might think, and happenings change, don't they? Our circumstances will change in life, and there are times when we will feel moments of great happiness, moments of great sadness, and that's right, that's appropriate. But joy is a deeper thing that can be experienced regardless of our emotions. And actually, it's very interesting that the New Testament in the Bible, it talks more about joy than it talks about happiness. In fact, in one of the letter of First Peter, Peter writes to these Christians who are undergoing suffering and persecution, living as refugees. And he says, actually, despite the fact you are suffering all kinds of trials, you can experience inexpressible joy. Why? Because they know God and they also have hope in where life is heading. They know life isn't futile and there's a God who makes sense of even the hard times in life.
It's interesting you say that. I remember being quite struck that just the other day I sent a video of this group of Christians in Ukraine, in I think one of the cities there, holding a little worship service in an underground station because of the bombing going on. And you look at it and you go, that makes no sense humanly, that you can find joy and celebration in the midst of a war zone, unless there is something more going on. Doesn't mean Christianity is true, but it does mean it does.
Mm.
If it is true, it offers something quite significant. Let's move on, because I've got two more things I wanted to talk about with you before we get to the Q&A. Again, for the Q&A, we mentioned this earlier. If you've joined us since then, you can take part in the Q&A. You can submit a question for Michael, or if you don't have a question, you can vote on another person's question. There's a URL will pop up below me in a minute, pigeonhole.at/Solas 3 March. Go to there, and you'll see there are some questions already beginning to come in. Submit a question, vote on another question, and we'll put those to Michael in about 20 minutes' time. But so, Michael, second topic that I'd like to talk about for a few minutes, just talk about happiness. Next chapter of the book that really fascinated me was you have a chapter called Making Sense of Society. And of course, that intrigued because of, there's a whole debate around what society is and what it looks like and so on. We haven't got time to go into, but one thing did strike me, that we live right now in a very diverse age. There's a time when we talk about society, and so Western society particularly was largely homogenous. We had people of a similar racial background, similar skin coloring, similar religious beliefs, fairly uniform. Now we are incredibly diverse, and I think you can also see, partly caused by social media, but other things, people really struggling with those differences. So I suppose my first question for you is, how do we live together despite our differences? I think this is the big question of the 21st century. How do we live together despite our differences and keep society together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think you're right. In one sense, society has become globally more similar. Globalization has meant that actually it's harder to differentiate sometimes between what one culture is like and what another culture is like. There's been a assimilation, and there is greater similarity. And yet, I guess the flip side to that is this sense that society has become more polarized. Part of that, as I talk about in the book, is the effect of the internet and social media, exacerbated by COVID, that we're driven into kind of smaller and smaller groupings of niche interests and political views or whatever in our online communities. In the past, we lived literally in a physical society, and we had to learn to get on with the people around us. And now we live in a global society where I can find people who are like me all over the world. And I may not find them living in my village or even in my city, but I can find them somewhere in the world. And so I can live in this kind of community of people who have the same ideas, passions, interests, and so on. And part of that can be a good thing, bringing people together, but part of that can be a bad thing because it actually drives people apart. Means that we aren't interacting face to face with people who are different, who have different views, different ideas to our own. And so we end up living in an increasingly polarized society. And we've seen that in all sorts of ways, whether it comes to political issues like Brexit, American elections, when it comes to issues about, say, LGBT rights and stuff like that, or debate around how we respond to the environmental crisis. There seems to be an increasingly strong debate raging, often online. Certainly British people seem to be a lot stronger online than we are face to face. I mean, we never disagree with each other when we're face to face, but online we can be sometimes stronger, can't we, in that way? And that can be a really difficult thing. I guess partly there are some practical solutions to that, which is actually meeting people face to face and becoming friends with people makes us more open to their views and more open to people who are different to us than if we just stay in that kind of online world. And I found that really refreshing, actually, post-COVID. I realized one of the dangers for me during COVID was to surround myself with people who were very similar to myself. And it's really refreshing to just be bumping into people who are very different, who have different views. And it makes us perhaps try to understand why people have those views, why they might be different, to think the best of them and their motives for holding those different views or political opinions, rather than thinking the worst of them. And it's interesting that studies show that very often we're very bad at thinking of why people might hold different views to ourselves. We assume the worst motives rather than the best. And Jonathan Haidt, in his book The Righteous Mind, talks particularly about that, how the political left and the political right assume the very worst motives for their opponents. So how do we live together? Partly by actually interacting with people in person. I think that can make a real difference to our interactions. I think also the Christian faith offers us something quite significant in this regard. And that is, we live in a society that has talked for a long time about tolerance. We need to be tolerant of each other. We need to be tolerant of everyone, and so on. And to an extent, that's good. And I think to an extent, that is a knock-on implication of the Christian faith. But I think one of the problems we're having, particularly as we grapple with what we might call cancel culture, is that there are some things that we don't want to tolerate. I mean, racism and sexism and sexual abuse and those kind of things are not things that we want to tolerate. So when people make light of that, when people seem to be in support of things like that, how do we react? And so in a tolerant society, that only works to a certain extent, doesn't it? And I think one of the things that the Christian faith has right at its center is this offer of forgiveness. And forgiveness is very different from tolerance. Forgiveness is not saying everything that someone thinks or does is okay. Forgiveness is actually when we say, no, I think some things that people say and do are wrong, but actually forgiveness both affirms the wrongness of certain things whilst offering an opportunity for reconciliation. Whereas tolerance can't affirm that it's wrong. Basically, tolerance is saying it was fine. And it doesn't really hold that much hope for reconciliation either. And so I think in a divided society, the forgiveness that Christianity offers, not just vertically with God, but then also horizontally with each other, is something which we really need in society. And I think often we're struggling to find.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was quite struck that I was rereading recently. There's a gay atheist journalist called Douglas Murray who wrote a best-selling book called The Madness of Crowds, looking at some of the issues around sort of sexuality and gender and stuff in our culture. And so fairly committed atheist, but there's an amazing chapter in that where he just talks about forgiveness and says that he worries in some ways that our society has borrowed, as he puts it, all the sort of judgmental bits of Christianity and has lost the forgiveness part. So, you say the wrong thing, hold the wrong opinion, phrase yourself badly, you can find yourself cancelled, removed, wiped out, but there's no way back. So Christianity always offered that kind of way back, that way to deal with the mess. And I like the way you put it, by recognizing there's something wrong here, but there's still that pathway back. I'm just conscious time is against us, and I want to get on to the Q&A. So again, Q&A for folks who want to take part in the Q&A. Some more questions just come in while I spoke there. Don't forget pigeonhole.at/Solas 3rd of March, and either submit your own question or vote for somebody else's. Take a question that you really like and make someone's day by voting their question. Or just pick the hardest one you can. You can think Bannister's giving up far too easy in a time. This isn't a grilling. It's certainly not a roasting. So, pick a tough question, vote it up the list. Last area I want to talk about, Michael, for next 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll dive into the questions. So we've thought about happiness, we've thought about society. And I actually had a couple more questions on society, but you gave such a wonderful, full answer that you covered it all. So it's good. Last thing, making sense of love. Making sense of love. Boy, there's a topic. So much of our culture is obsessed with love. There are movies about it, books about it. We have Valentine's Day a couple of weeks ago, songs, poems, you name it. But I guess the first question is, when it comes to how we make sense of love, which I think is a question lots of people wrestle with, what do we mean by love? Is there an issue that perhaps we throw that word out there, but we haven't stopped and thought what we mean by love?
Absolutely. I talk in the book about a conversation I had in Denmark a few years ago now, actually. It was after a talk I'd given. I was chatting to students and asked a group of students sitting there what they thought of the talk, and probably because they weren't British, they actually gave the honest answer rather than saying something like, it's nice. And this girl said, well, I'm just not interested in Christianity. I said, well, fine. I said, well, what are you interested in? And she says, well, I'm really interested in love. And I said, well, that's great. But how would you define love? And she thought for a moment. And after a few seconds, she came back and said, well, I'm just not sure, actually. I don't know. So I said, well, can I give you a definition of love? And she said, sure. So I said, well, love is a chemical reaction that's evolved in our brains to make us attracted to people, normally of the opposite sex, so that we reproduce and pass on our DNA. And she looked at me, and maybe because her boyfriend was sitting next to her, she said, well, that's not love. To which I said, well, yeah, no, I don't think that's love either. But can you tell me why it's not? And she, again, thought for a few moments, and then she said, well, I'm not sure I can. And I said, but that's the problem, isn't it? Because if the worldview that we believe says that we're basically just people who've evolved over time, and there is no God or nothing beyond the material, how do we account for love as being anything more than just a useful chemical reaction that has enhanced our survival properties? How do we account for it being more significant? And actually, that is a very profound question. I mean, Richard Dawkins, the atheist, was honest enough to say that, there are some things that seem to be evolutionary mistakes. Why would someone continue to love their spouse if they discovered that their spouse was infertile? From an evolutionary point of view, that would make no sense. Now, he does say that these are blessed, precious misfirings, although I'm not sure where he gets that value judgment from, because it's certainly not from within the system that he's talking about. So this idea of love being a real thing, well, what is that? But most of us have a sense when we talk about love, it's more than just the chemical reaction. It's more than just an evolutionary advantageous thing. There's something profound about love. It's something beautiful about love. And so this girl looked at me and she said, well, what would you say love is? And I just said, well, actually, as a Christian, love has got a lot to do with God. And she said, well, how come? And I said, well, in the Bible, one of the most fundamental things that the Bible says about God is that God is love. So God, in his very being, in his very essence, is a loving being. The Bible talks about God being this loving relationship, the Father, the Son, the Spirit. Theologians call it the Trinity, but basically it's a way of explaining how God is a multi-personal, relational God. At the heart of God is this loving relationship. And then it says in the Bible that God creates human beings in his image. So if the most important thing about God is that he is love, the most important thing about being human, therefore, surely is that we are created to love and to be loved. And so love very much comes from God, is a reflection of what God is like, and is actually, fundamentally at the heart of what it means to be human.
A kind of question that flows out of that, then, Michael. I mean, that's a really interesting explanation of what love means. Perhaps a last question to throw some thoughts out, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. Why then is true love so hard to find? If this God you've been talking about exists, and if love is more than just the physics of neurons in my brain, why is love so darn hard to find? I mean, shouldn't it just be easy if that's what as God has created us for?
Yeah, which is a good question. If this is the way that things were created, why do I not seem to experience that? Maybe that's what you'd be thinking. And the Bible says God is the source of love. We're created in the image of this God who is love. But the Bible also gives us a framework to understand that we are cut off from this source of love. So we still reflect something of what he's like, and yet we are. It's a bit like when I remove my phone from the plug in the morning. It's cut off from the source of power. It starts to run dry. It needs to be replugged in, reconnected before it dies. And because we've become disconnected from the God who is the source of love, so many of our problems when it comes to love stem from that. One of the problems, I think, is this, that because we were created to be connected to God, the source of all love, and that is to be the source from which we can then love others. Because we're disconnected from God, we then start to try and find the love that ultimately only God can give us in the relationships we have with other people. Now, it's not that relationships with other people are wrong. They're beautiful. God created us for relationships, for spousal relationships, but also for friendships and family relationships. But if I look for and expect any human relationship to fill the void and need of love that I was created to have met from God, I'm always going to be disappointed, because no one is going to be able to fulfill that gap, that void. No one's going to be big enough. And if I look to someone else to do that for me, then they're not going to be able to do that. We're going to frustrate each other because we're placing a burden of expectation upon each other that we can't have or we can't fulfill. And that's why, again, at the heart of the Christian faith is this offer of being reconnected to this God of love, a God who in love made it possible for us to be connected to him again. Ultimately, as explained in the book, through Jesus' death, the supreme act of sacrificial love is the means by which we can become connected again to the God of love. And then once we know God's love and the security that brings, knowing that nothing, to quote one Bible writer, can separate me from the love of God. If I know that security, that frees me to love other people more fully and more sacrificially, perhaps. than it would have done. It doesn't mean I love other people less. I think actually coming to know and experience God's love and to love him most means that I can love other people better and love other people more.
Fantastic. Lots of really helpful food for thought in there, Michael. In a moment, we're going to jump into the Q&A. We've got some questions coming in, and there are some curveballs in there, which is fun. Just before we do that, we mentioned at the top of the show, top of the webinar, that there's a chance to win Michael's book. So we've been talking about making sense of life, and we have five copies of this puppy to give away. One catch: you have to live in the UK. This particular giveaway is only open to UK folks. But what you do, you simply email my colleague David. His email address is there on the screen, support@solas-cpc.org, and just give your name. And then if you are one of the lucky winners, pull up the hat. We'll get back to you, get your address from you, and pop a copy of Michael's book in the post to you. And so we'd love to give those 5 copies away, because then we get them off David's desk and he can get some real work done. Now let's come back to the questions. So the first question, Michael, are you ready? Are you
Yep.
raring to go? Here we go. There's a couple of questions that have floated to the top of the poll, which I quite like, actually. They're both really good ones, actually, which is interesting, showing that people have been listening to what you said. So the first one I'm going to throw at you is someone has asked, anonymous person has asked, are you really saying that atheists can't make sense of life? Isn't that a bit arrogant? So basically, are you saying that you've got to be a believer in God to make sense of life? If you're not a believer in God, you're basically toast. You can't make sense of life. Is that true? Is that a bit cocky to be saying that? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess I want to distinguish between maybe saying, can atheists make sense of life, and can atheism make sense of life? I've got friends who are atheists. They don't believe in God. And yet they would say there are some things that are really precious in life, like human rights and equality and love and family and making this world a better place and caring for the environment and seeking to live in a selfless manner. And all of those things are wonderful. And I want to say, as a Christian, absolutely. Like, those things are the things that really seem to make life worth living. But does atheism as an ideology, as a system, account for why those things are important? And that's what I want to question. And ultimately, I think what I would say in the book is I don't think atheism provides us with a reason, a basis for why these things matter. Now, it doesn't mean that atheists don't live for things that really matter or care about these things. They do. But I want to have a system of belief that means that I can care for these things, not in spite of my belief system, but because of my belief system. I can embrace love and human rights and equality, not in spite of the fact that my beliefs don't give me any basis for it, but because my belief system gives me foundation for that. And I'd say the Christian faith means that I can celebrate these things, not in spite, but because of the worldview, the belief that I have.
I think that's really helpful. I think it's also worth saying as well, I guess, that some of these things we want to defend, right? Human rights. Look what's going on in Ukraine right now. If you want to be someone who wants to not just enjoy the idea of justice and rights, but actually start defending them against those who would attack them, we need something more than just personal preference, I guess, right? Okay, so the next question then. That was a great question. Thank you, whoever asked that. Next question has a name to it. So Terry has asked this question. So Terry asks this, Michael: even if God can make sense of life, which God are we talking about? You sort of, I guess Terry might be thinking you've kind of assumed, you've jumped from we need God to make sense of life, but therefore it has to be the Christian God. I mean, after all, doesn't every religion talk about God being a God of love, a God who cares for us deeply, all these kind of things? So if your argument stands, somebody listening to you could go, you know what, that's really, you've convinced me, Michael, therefore I'm going to become a Buddhist, therefore I'm going to become a Muslim. Why Christianity in particular? Why Jesus in particular?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when I'm talking about God in the book, or when I've talked about it in this webinar, I am talking about the God that's most clearly revealed himself in Jesus. The Christian conviction is that if you want to understand what God is like, we need to look at the person of Jesus and see how he relates to people, to see what he says, because the claim that Jesus seems to be making in the accounts of his life is that he speaks with God's authority, that if we encounter Jesus, we have encountered God. So I'm not talking about a generic God. I'm talking about the God revealed in Jesus. Does that matter? Yeah, it really does, because actually the God that Jesus reveals, in my understanding, is very different to the God that other religions speak about. And that may not be politically correct to say in Western culture, although it kind of is fairly obvious when you start looking at other religions, because you realize that, even on the basic level of does God exist and how many gods are there are very different answers among the world's major religions. So they're clearly not all saying the same thing, and it's fairly disingenuous just to say to different people from different religions, you basically all believe the same thing. Basically often means that we've not really looked into anything that any of them believe. But I'd also want to say, I think as I have interacted and discussed with people from different religious backgrounds, I've discovered actually some of these things that we've spoken about and that I look at in the book can't be accounted for in the same way in other religious systems or philosophies, just as atheism maybe struggles to account for them. So, for instance, talking about love, as a Christian, I can say love is very fundamental to who God is, because God is love, because God is this loving relationship. And yet, actually, my Muslim friends would very strongly refute that idea of God being a loving relationship of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is not three persons united together in love. He is a singularity, and that's very much central to Islamic beliefs. And so I want to take that, as what they say. But of course, that raises questions, which is, if God is a singularity, how does God express love? How is God love if there wasn't anyone for God to love at some point? And then that adds interesting questions like, well, if God couldn't have always been eternally love, how is God now fundamentally love? And actually, why did God create us? Was it to share his love, or was it to get something from us? So I think our beliefs about God make a big difference in terms of how we think about love, how we think about freedom. Again, atheism, I talk about in the freedom chapter, has a very deterministic view, ultimately, I think consistently, of the world. We are basically just the products of our DNA and our environment. The idea of giving a basis to why we have real responsibility and choice is difficult to find. But again, actually, talking to Muslim friends, this sense of the will of Allah, inshallah, determining all events, is something which, again, almost seems to supersede human freedom in that regard. Whereas in the Christian faith, there seems to be this understanding of God, who is, yes, all powerful, but in his power has chosen to give us real responsibility, which does mean, to an extent, we have real freedom as well. So yeah, I would say it's really important which God we're talking about. And if you don't agree with me, I would just say, don't just read my book. Look at how other religious faiths might account for these things and ask those questions of Islam or Hinduism or whatever. Stick them side by side and see what you think.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And I think the way you sort of laid it out there, I think what you believe about God is foundational for so much. I don't think we always fully appreciate that it really does go at the sort of foundation layer, even if you're an atheist, because then you have to build from there. And a cheeky bit of self-promotion, actually. I wrote a book called The Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God. So if you want to dig into particularly the differences between what Michael has been talking about and Islam, there's a whole book there and content on the Solas website. So Terry, thank you for that question. Next question is also got a name on it. So Amanda has asked this one. Thank you for this question, Amanda. Amanda, I love the way she's phrased this. She's okay. I get that I think she wrote this right at the start. So I get you're going to explain how your Christianity gives you, answers to lots of stuff. The answers, they're coherent, they work for you, and so on. But that doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean that it's true. All will work for me. But actually, I think you've talked about the work for me piece. Let's pick up the true thing. Because what would you say to someone like Amanda? And I hope, Amanda, I hope I've paraphrased this fairly. Even if you say, Michael, that believing this stuff, believing in Christianity gives you a good foundation for these things, that doesn't actually make it true. How can we be sure this is true and not just something that psychologically is helpful for you and for others?
Well, I wouldn't discount the fact, firstly, that because Christianity has explanatory power, it's therefore isn't true. Actually, that's one of the things that I want to ask of any philosophy or worldview. Does this explain reality? Does it make sense of my life? Does it work, not just in a lecture room, but does it work in the day-to-day reality of life in this world? And one of the things I want to say is, yeah, it does. It really makes sense of these things. We can think deeply about all of these things from a Christian perspective, and find a basis for why they really matter. But I also would want to say, I think there is maybe a more objective way that we can ask whether this is true. And that's because ultimately the Christian faith isn't based just on an idea. Lots of religions are fundamentally ideas or systems of morality, but it's based on an event. It's based on Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And that's really significant because to prove or disprove the validity or the truth of an idea is very difficult, isn't it? And the problem with many religions is it's very hard to objectively verify whether they're true because there's no way you could falsify them. You couldn't show that they were false because it's a system of teaching, it's an idea, it's a revelation or whatever. No one else was there. There's no way of disproving or rejecting it other than saying, I don't like it, it doesn't work for me. The difference is because the Christian faith is centered on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that sets itself up for an investigation of a different type to be able to say, did this really happen? And in particular, of course, did the resurrection happen? Lots of people have lived and died. Only one religious leader in history, the claim is made that he rose from the dead. And surprisingly, maybe for us in our Western kind of materialist ears, there is actually surprising evidence, a surprising amount of evidence that says that this is actually objectively true. This is reasonable. When we check it out, the reasonable thing to do would be to say, actually, yeah, this stands up to scrutiny. And boy, Christian faith over the last 200 years has been subjected to a lot of scrutiny. And yet, the more I scrutinize it and the more it is questioned, the more I think actually it has a really strong foundation. That's not primarily the basis of making sense of life. I did write a book before that called But Is It True? So a little bit of shameless self-promotion. Then that one also might be helpful. That looks at the kind of more objective question.
I think also, I mean, just to press into that slightly, kind of, Michael, I think it's right. It's interesting you've written those two books. I've often thought, and I'd love to get your perspective on this. I wonder if it's helpful the way that you've approached it this evening, because in one sense, if Christianity doesn't have this kind of impact, it doesn't have an implication for love and meaning and truth and beauty and all the things you talk about in the book, then in one sense, I can understand why somebody would go, well, why would I want to consider it? Christians can sometimes jump too quickly to the truth, question. But if you've shown that there are all these implications that all these things that follow if Christianity is true, then I'd like to think that the next step for the thoughtful person is to go, well, now I need to know if it really matters. If somebody knocks on my door and says, I've got this amazing gadget, and I've got 20 reasons why it's the best gadget in the world, I'm still going to slam the door in their face unless they say, I happen to know that you've got this massive problem, maybe one of your kids is really sick with something and this gadget will revolutionize their lives. Then I might be willing to listen to the evidence for their claims. So I wonder sometimes actually for Christians, we leap too quickly to the evidence piece. And actually it's important to get it this way around, to begin with the difference and then show why it's true. Am I sort of barking up?
Absolutely. I think in my work in universities, it's interesting because historically, sometimes students say, well, we need to start with a talk about, why can we trust the Bible? But of course, you go around the campus today and say, would you like to come and hear a talk on why trust the Bible? And most people would say, well, no, I don't. Why would I care whether I trust the Bible or not? The Bible's an irrelevant book. It's got nothing to say. But if you can spend 3 days explaining why the Bible has real relevance to every area of life, you may be more inclined then to want to know whether this book is actually true, whether I can then stake my life on the claims that it's making. So I'd say absolutely. And also, different people come at the Christian faith in different ways. Some people like C.S. Lewis, it was very kind of intellectual, can it be real? Is it just a myth or is it the true myth, as he coined the phrase? Other people may come at the Christian faith from the aspect of community. Just chatting to someone the other day who said actually it was the sense of welcome and community that really drew me to investigate the Christian faith. And other people I find come to the Christian faith more out of a sense of existential need. I look at the world, I look at these questions that I have about the world. How can I make sense of these things? And the Christian faith can actually speak into those questions that we have. So different people might start investigating the Christian faith for different reasons, but I think knowing that it is worth investigating and important then might lead us to ask the question, like you say, is it true? Yeah.
Right, now this is interesting. There are two questions here that I'm going to sort of try and combine. One's anonymous and one is from a guy chap called Roger. So the anonymous question, someone has written, and gosh, it's interesting. You think behind every question there's a story. Right, somebody has written, they've said, I'm a Christian and life sometimes still feels meaningless. Help. But then Roger has said, well, what sort of sense could Job, and for people who know the Bible, who don't know the Bible, Job was a character in the Old Testament who life was going really, really well, and then suddenly everything went spectacularly kind of wrong. Everything he had, job, family, health, all taken away. And that's a profound, book that looks at the whole question of suffering. And Roger says, well, what sort of sense could Job make of life while he was like going through the mill? What happens if life is not making sense to us at this existential moment? So there's two different questions, one quite personal, one slightly more theoretical. But, if we are personally experiencing suffering right now, I mean, think of people in Ukraine right now, what is it? How does the meaning question pan out if right at this very, very moment, everything seems that it's just mess and chaos and brokenness?
Yeah. If I start with the second one first, if I can, I think to go back to the story of Job in the Bible, some people reckon it's the oldest book, the oldest story in the Bible. The story of Job is interesting because all of Job's friends are trying to give an explanation of why Job is suffering in the way that he has and is. And actually, we know why he's suffering. We're given this kind of like cosmic view of what's happening behind the scenes, as it were, in heaven. But they don't see it. And actually, they're all completely wrong. They're all completely getting the wrong end of the stick. And interestingly, even at the end of the story, Job still doesn't know what's going on. There's no specific answer of Job, this happened for this reason. And so I think we have to be really careful. We do not have exhaustive answers to our questions when it comes to the frustrations and the futility of our world. Why did this happen in this way? Or why did that happen to that person? Often we just have to say, we have no idea. We don't know. But what I think the Bible does do is it gives us a framework into which we can at least make sense of our experience and response to suffering. And the ultimate framework is, and I talk about it in the chapter on suffering, that the world we live in is not the way it once was. Something's gone wrong, it's broken. And the world we live in is not the way it one day will be. Because of the hope of the resurrection, the Bible says one day this world will be made new, set free from all that spoils it, and perfect justice will be done. But in the midst of the story that we are in right now, we're in a world that is broken. And there's a very helpful verse in a book called Romans in the New Testament, where it talks about the creation being subjected to frustration, or some translations of the Bible use the word futility. And in the book, I say it's interesting because the atheist worldview consistently says, well, life is just futile. There is no point. There's no rhyme or reason to it. And in a sense, that sounds a little bit like the atheist viewpoint, doesn't it? Life is futile. And that's often how it feels. And I want to be, careful that we don't too quickly try and jump into giving simplistic answers. But the difference is, the Bible says this is not the end of the story. This is not the way it once was, and it's not the way it one day will be. But in the midst, there is a lot of injustice. There is a lot that is unfair. There's a lot that we never understand. There's a lot that shouldn't be this way. And in a sense, therefore, one of the things that I find most helpful as a Christian is being able to say, this is really messed up. I was just chatting to someone just this week who felt a great degree of anger. They said, I don't know whether I believe in God, but if I do, I'm angry at him for stuff that's happened in my life. And they talk very honestly about things that had happened to them. And I said, actually, I think your emotion is absolutely right. But have you ever thought that God is also angry about this stuff as well? And we looked at this story about how Jesus went to this guy called Lazarus's tomb. He just died, a guy about the same age, saw a grieving family in their loss. And the two emotions that we see Jesus has are anger and grief. He weeps. And I think, what if God also is angered by the injustice of our world, because he knows that it wasn't meant to be this way? What if he also weeps with us in our pain? And what if, because he's done that with us and for us, we can now ultimately hope beyond it? So there are no simple answers. But as I've found really helpful to reflect on, if there is a God who loved me enough to come into this messed up world, to die on a cross for me, if that's true, if that really happens, then I can't say that this is a God who doesn't care, because actually he's shown in a very profound way that he really does.
Wow, really some helpful stuff there, Michael. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. So last question. So I do apologize to anyone who doesn't get their question asked. There's sort of two here that I'm just like, I'd like to look at both of them, but we haven't got time to do both of them. So I'm going to end with this one because I think this is a fascinating question, Michael. What can Christianity offer to someone who has everything? Now, the person who asked that doesn't give me much background. It occurs to me two people might ask that question. If you are someone who is a seeker or a skeptic, you might be asking, well, hang on a minute, life actually looks pretty good. And okay, maybe there are some questions about what justifies it, but you know what, do I need to worry? Quite frankly, life is good. Maybe I don't need to worry about that. I can't ask why it's good, but it is good. The other person who could be asking it, of course, is I know Christians sometimes who really want to share the love of Christ with their friends run into this one. How do I talk about Jesus as somebody who appears to have everything? Their marriage is good, their family is good, their job is good, everything is good. How what does Christianity have to say, offer, however you want to phrase it, to someone who has everything? So why don't you have a crack at that as our last question this evening?
Yeah. And I think, in a sense, it is hard, isn't it, for someone who is successful, who has satisfactory amounts of material wealth, as far as they're aware, a good amount of physical health, and no pressing concerns, to feel, well, why do I need God? Where does God come into it? I guess there's two things you could say. One would be to say, well, just because that's the way life is now, it certainly won't be the way life always is. And rather than waiting until life gets tough to ask those big questions about, is there a God and how can I know him? Wouldn't it be better to think about a framework for life that will enable us to be able to be prepared for those times when they come? Because they do. And actually, I think one of the things that we've noticed in Western society in the last 2 years is that we're not immune, are we? We're so used to watching the news for, certainly in my lifetime, things that happen to other people in other parts of the world, in other continents even. And then suddenly we have a COVID pandemic, which dramatically impacts all of us. Now we have a war in Europe, which may or may not impact us personally, but the knock-on implications are already impacting us in different ways. We're not immune to the brokenness of our world. And if we are blessed to be experiencing a brief moment where everything seems to be going well, I'm happy, that's great. But it's not going to stay that way, is it? Being perfectly honest. So why not think about a foundation for life that will keep us going and can't be taken away? And that's the great thing about knowing Jesus. It's the one thing that can't be taken away. If I build my foundation on life on anything else, be it a relationship, be it work, be it my health, be it by hobbies, one by one, all of those things can be taken away. But the other flip side of it, and I quoted C.S. Lewis earlier, I find it so helpful. C.S. Lewis saying, God finds our desires are not too great, but too small. What if actually we've settled for too little? What if we think, my comfortable life, in my comfortable job, with my comfortable family is all that life is about? What if there was more to it? What if actually I'd become so introspective I'd missed the bigger picture? What if God had more for my life? And so I want to sometimes say, have you ever thought that there could be more than just the 9 to 5, just more than the holidays a few times a year, more than this, and life that can go on beyond this one as well? Help people to catch a glimpse that there could be something else. And there's a beautiful story in the Bible of a guy, or fascinating story, I should say, of a guy who comes to Jesus. He's young, he's wealthy, he's influential, and yet he comes asking Jesus of how he can get eternal life. Now, why does he do that? We're not told, but I think perhaps it's because when you get everything you want, you realize it's not everything that you need. Interestingly, working with students, it's very easy for students to say, well, when I graduate, when I get married, when I settle down, when I get the job I want, then I'll have it. And so we place our hopes for happiness and satisfaction in a future event. But what if it doesn't deliver? And it's interesting, listening to some of the people who seemingly have everything and yet have realized that it just doesn't satisfy. I mean, Jim Carrey brilliant quote by him a few years ago where he said everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of just so they can know that it's not the answer. There is something more, and wonderfully the Christian faith says we can know what that is, and we can have that because of Jesus. So whether life is great or whether life is awful, this is for everyone, and this is great. It does, as you said, make sense of life in all its different aspects.
Michael, this has been an absolutely kind of fascinating conversation, and thank you for taking those questions. So again, folks, we've been talking this evening about Michael's book, relatively new book, Making Sense of Life. You can find out more about that book and about Michael's other work and writings and whatnot on his website. There's the URL, michaelotts.com. That's not micalotts.com. That's michaelotts.com. Don't forget, if you haven't entered the competition to win that book, we've got 5 giveaways. You can, it's not too late to email support@solas-cpc.org. Give us your name, and if we pull your name out of the hat, we'll get back to you for your address. UK postage only, I'm afraid. We've only got those 5 copies sponsored as prizes for the UK. If you live in the rest of the world, you will have to just buy the book. It's available worldwide. And only all that is left now for me is to say to Michael, thank you so much for being part of this, and thank you to all of you for watching at home. Do keep track on the Solas website and social media channels. We've got another of these webinars coming up in about a couple of weeks' time, when I'll be talking to another guy called Jim Warner-Wallace, who's got an amazing kind of backstory, former very committed atheist, and now a murder detective, and all kinds of amazing story Jim's got, and also a really interesting conversation around faith evidence. But Michael, once again, thanks for being part of this, and we'll catch you again on a Solas webinar, folks, soon. Bye for now.
Bye.